In the autumn of 1177, every fact available to Saladin told him he would win. He had 26,000 mounted warriors. His opponent had 500 knights. He had unified Egypt and Syria under a single command, something no Islamic ruler had achieved in a generation. He had the wealth of the Nile, the manpower of Damascus, and the religious authority to call holy war across a vast empire. He had survived 2 assassination attempts and emerged from both with his power intact. He was 40 years old, at the absolute peak of his military career, and he was facing a 16-year-old king who was dying of leprosy. The numbers were 52 to 1. Every rational calculation favored Saladin. And on November 25th, 1177, his army was destroyed in a single afternoon. He reached Cairo 13 days later with approximately 1/10 of the force that had marched out. This is not the story of how the weak won. It is the story of how the strong failed, and what Saladin's rational model of warfare could not account for. He would spend the next 10 years learning that lesson. And when he finally applied what Baldwin IV had taught him, the result would be the fall of Jerusalem. To understand what made Saladin's moment so perfect, you have to understand what had happened to Jerusalem in the months before he struck. In 1177, Philip of Alsace arrived in the Holy Land at the head of a substantial military force. His arrival was welcome. Jerusalem needed men, but Philip had no intention of deploying his force where Jerusalem needed it most. He took with him a significant portion of the Knights Hospitaller and many of the Knights Templar, the 2 military orders that formed the backbone of Jerusalem's professional fighting strength. He marched north, accomplished nothing, sailed home. He left Jerusalem stripped. Saladin, through his intelligence network, knew exactly what had happened. He chose November 1177 to launch the largest campaign of his career, not because it was the most dramatic moment, but because it was the most logical one. This was correct. This was rational. And it was only the first of the correct calculations that would lead him to disaster. Saladin had spent 8 years building toward this campaign. He had come to Egypt in 1169 as a military commander serving a dying dynasty and had systematically dismantled it. He had abolished the Fatimid Caliphate in 1171, conquered Syria in 1174, won a series of engagements against rivals who had assumed a Kurdish general from Tikrit would be easy to contain. He had survived 2 assassin attempts on his life, men who reached his tent, who cut through his bodyguard, who put blades against the chain mail protecting his throat. Both times he walked away. By 1177, he controlled territory from the Nile to the Euphrates. He could field an army that no individual crusader state could match. This was the moment to finish what the Islamic world had been trying to accomplish since the First Crusade had seized Jerusalem in 1099. He had the army. He had the momentum. He had the opportunity. He marched. Baldwin IV had been 9 years old when his tutor noticed something wrong. The tutor was William of Tyre, and what he observed was that Baldwin, during wrestling games with other boys, did not react to pain in his right arm and hand. The boys would dig their fingernails into each other, competing to see who would flinch first. Baldwin did not flinch, not because he was particularly brave, but because he couldn't feel it. The diagnosis was leprosy. By the time of Montgisard in 1177, Baldwin was 16. His hands had to be wrapped in bandages. He wore a silver mask to conceal what the disease had done to his face. He needed help putting on armor, had to be lifted onto his horse. When the pain made an upright seat impossible, his knights strapped him to the saddle. But the mind behind that deteriorating body remained, by every account, precise and strategic. And he had one quality that no amount of military experience could manufacture. He could not be threatened. A commander who fears death can be made to wait behind walls. Baldwin was 16 years old, already in the process of dying from a disease that would take his sight, his mobility, and eventually his life by age 24. He had no survival odds to calculate, because he had no survival odds. The disease had made his future non-negotiable. Saladin's model of how a rational commander behaves under pressure assumed a commander who wanted to survive. Baldwin did not fit the model. Saladin's army reached the coastal fortress of Ascalon on its march north toward Jerusalem. Ascalon was heavily fortified. A siege would take weeks. The prize was Jerusalem, not Ascalon. He bypassed it and marched on. This was correct. Standard military logic. But bypassing Ascalon left Baldwin free to use it as a base. And as the army moved north, the practical necessities of feeding 26,000 men asserted themselves. Horses alone consume 10 to 15 kilograms of fodder each day. The only way to meet it on campaign was to send foraging parties into the surrounding countryside. The foraging parties went out. The army dispersed. The combat formation that had marched so impressively out of Egypt stretched across miles of countryside in disconnected units. Commanders assumed there was time. Baldwin was behind the walls of a fortress, and a 16-year-old Leper King would not be fool enough to come out. This was the second correct assumption that would prove catastrophic. Among the men Baldwin could assemble at Ascalon were approximately 80 Knights Templar, under the command of their Grand Master, Odo de Saint-Amand. Odo had made a declaration that was unusual even by the standards of a military order that considered itself bound for martyrdom.
What we held in our hearts is now
he had stated that no Templar, including himself, would ever be ransomed. If a Templar was captured, he would remain a prisoner rather than be traded for. This was not merely a statement of principle. It was a military posture. Men who cannot be ransomed have no incentive to surrender. They charge where other men pull back. They hold where other men retreat. Odo's 80 knights were not fighting with the cold calculation of men who had accepted acceptable risk. They were fighting with the particular freedom of men who had already resolved the question of their own survival. And in the negative, 2 years after Montgisard, Odo would be captured by Saladin.
Reached a verdict.
Saladin offered an
You
exchange.
are to be removed.
Odo refused, per his own declaration. He died in Saladin's prison in 1180. But on November 25th, 1177, he was at the front of Baldwin's charge. Baldwin had perhaps 375 to 500 knights in total, including Odo's Templars and the knights who had answered his emergency conscription. The arriere band, calling every able-bodied man in the kingdom to arms. He ordered a forced march, 45 miles, 36 hours. For healthy men on well-rested horses, this was punishing. For a force that included a king who could not consistently maintain his saddle, it was something else entirely. When Baldwin could no longer hold himself upright, his knights took turns supporting him. When the pain made an upright seat impossible, they tied him to the stool. They did not slow down. By the morning of November 25th, the horses were foaming at the mouth. The men were staggering. Many could barely stand. They had covered an almost impossible distance because their king, who had every reason anyone could imagine to remain behind walls, had not remained behind walls. Before the charge, Baldwin ordered the true cross brought forward. The true cross was the most sacred relic in Jerusalem, a fragment of the cross on which the Crusaders believed Christ had been crucified. It was the physical anchor of their identity in the Holy Land, the object that transformed a military campaign into something the men understood as a covenant. Baldwin was helped down from his horse. On a battlefield he was barely strong enough to stand on, with bandaged hands, and a silver mask concealing what the disease had done to his face. The 16-year-old king knelt before the relic and prayed. The army watched their dying king ask God for strength he did not have. For a victory, the numbers said was impossible. Many of the knights wept. Fear does not disappear at moments like this, but it changes shape. It becomes something men can aim at the enemy, rather than at their own futures. The army that rose from that prayer was not 500 men who believed they could win. It was 500 men who had decided they would rather die in the charge than die watching Jerusalem fall from behind Ascalon's walls. Saladin could calculate the odds. He could not calculate this. Around 11 in the morning, Saladin's scouts reported dust clouds moving fast from the north. He did not believe it was Baldwin's main force. His reasoning was sound. A 16-year-old Leper King with fewer than 500 knights, facing an army of 26,000, would not leave the safety of Ascalon. He would wait for the siege. He would shelter behind walls and hope for relief. This was what a rational commander with 500 men against 26,000 would do. Saladin assumed it was a scouting party. The foraging parties were not recalled. The formation was not assembled. By the time the Crusader banners appeared on the ridge, the blood-red cross of the Templars, the gold of Jerusalem, it was midday, and the army that had seemed so perfectly positioned an hour earlier was still scattered across miles of Palestinian countryside, trying to reform into something that could fight. An army of 26,000 cannot become a wall of battle. In the time it takes 500 600 men to cover the last mile of a charge. The Templars formed the point of the attack. 80 men riding in a tight formation called the conroy, lances lowered, horses at full gallop. The line held with the discipline that 20 years of training had produced. Their vow of never retreating was not metaphorical. It was tactical. They would not slow, would not veer, would not stop unless the horses collapsed under them. They hit the center of Saladin's forming line at the point where the formation was weakest. Units still moving into position. Commanders still shouting orders that had not yet reached the men who needed to hear them. The first impact was not decisive because of the casualties it caused. What was catastrophic was what 80 Templars, charging at full speed, communicated to the troops they were charging at. Men who cannot turn back look different from men who have accepted acceptable risk. They charge faster. They hold the line tighter. They do not slow as the distance closes. Saladin's men had fought cavalry before. They had not seen cavalry that looked like this, because cavalry that looked like this had already decided it was not coming back. Confusion spread through the Muslim center. Some men froze. Some looked behind the Crusaders for the larger force that should logically have been there. In those seconds, the charge reached them. Baldwin had studied the terrain around Montgisard before the battle. What looked like open country, low hills, firm earth, ideal ground for cavalry, contained a network of ravines and natural cuts in the ground, shallow enough to be invisible from a distance, deep enough to become death traps when a large body of men tried to cross them in panic. An army moving in order can navigate ravines. An army in panic cannot. Men run toward perceived escape routes. Horses follow the men ahead of them. When the man ahead falls into a ravine, the man behind cannot stop. Baldwin had seen this. Saladin had not considered it, because he had not expected to be routing. As the Muslim center broke and panic spread outward, one unit stepping back, the next seeing it and believing the line had broken, the retreating army began running into the ground that had looked so promising that morning. The ravines did their work. Saladin's personal guard began to waver as the battle collapsed around them. The Sultan was forced to flee. He abandoned his horse and mounted a fast camel for the retreat to Egypt. Saladin reached Cairo on December 8th, 1177, 13 days after the battle. He had left with 26,000 men. He arrived with approximately 2,600. The other 23,000 were dead, captured, or dispersed somewhere in the Palestinian hills. Muslim historians would later write that Montgisard was a wound to Saladin's reputation so severe that it could only be redeemed by a victory of equivalent scale. He spent the next decade looking for it. And when he found it, he used what Baldwin IV had taught him. After Montgisard, Saladin and Baldwin arranged a 2-year truce in 1180. Saladin did not just rebuild. He studied what had happened at Montgisard methodically, the way a good commander studies a defeat. He understood why the foraging parties had created vulnerability. He understood what had driven 500 men to charge 26,000. And he understood one thing above everything else. The Crusaders would follow their relic into any position, no matter how exposed, if the relic itself were sufficiently at stake. This was the lesson. He filed it away. He completed the encirclement of Jerusalem. In 1183, he captured Aleppo. Closing the ring he had been drawing around the Crusader states for years. Meanwhile, Baldwin was going blind by 1182. He could not walk without assistance. He continued to govern from a body that was systematically shutting down. He died in the spring of 1185. He was 24 years old. He was buried in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, in the city he had spent his reign defending. He did not see what came next. On July 4th, 1187, 2 years after Baldwin's death, the Crusader army marched out to meet Saladin at a place called the Horns of Hattin. They carried the true cross. Saladin had anticipated this. He had spent 10 years understanding the relic's role in Crusader psychology, the way it transformed an army from men fighting a battle into men fulfilling a covenant. He knew they would follow it. He built the trap accordingly. He cut them off from water. He encircled them on a waterless plateau in the July heat. He set fire to the dried grass around their position and let the smoke and thirst do what his cavalry would finish. The Crusader army was destroyed almost entirely. The true cross was captured. Jerusalem fell to Saladin in October 1187. The relic that had anchored the Crusaders' greatest victory was taken at their greatest defeat. The man who had knelt before it at Ascalon had been dead for 2 years, and the commander who had fled on a camel from Montgisard had turned his defeat into a decade of study, and his study into a trap that no amount of courage could escape. Saladin was not careless at Montgisard. He was rational. Every decision he made was the decision a competent commander, with 26,000 men and a strategic objective, would make. His error was not poor judgment. It was a perfect model. Applied to a situation the model could not describe. His model assumed a 16-year-old king with leprosy would choose survival. It assumed a force of 500 men would not charge 26,000. It assumed rational actors would behave rationally, calculating their odds, protecting their forces, waiting for better conditions. Baldwin was not a rational actor in the sense Saladin's model required. He was a young man who had been told at age 9 that his body would betray him. He knew this. He had governed in this knowledge since he was 13 years old. At Montgisard, he had already made the calculation that Saladin could not factor in. He was not choosing between fighting and surviving. He was choosing between dying in the charge and dying watching Jerusalem fall. The numbers said 500 men couldn't stop 26,000. The numbers were right. The numbers measured the wrong thing. What decided Montgisard was not strength or numbers, or the tactical genius of the Templar charge, or the accident of terrain. It was a 16-year-old king kneeling in a battlefield with bandaged hands, asking for strength he didn't have, for a victory the numbers didn't allow, and then being lifted back to his horse and riding toward the enemy line anyway. Saladin was right about everything. He was wrong about that. But here is what the story costs to tell honestly. Baldwin died at 24. His kingdom fractured. Jerusalem fell 2 years after his death to the same commander he had defeated at Montgisard. The victory was real. The kingdom Baldwin spent his life defending was not. What the battle gave Jerusalem was not salvation. It was 10 years. 10 years during which a boy king governed from a dying body, won an impossible battle, and bought time his successors could not use. Whether that was enough is not a question. History answers. Montgisard happened. Hattin happened. The true cross was carried to both. The man who knelt before it at Ascalon never knew which way the story ended. He only knew that on November 25th, 1177, he had a choice between the charge and the walls, and that the charge was the only option that let him remain who he was. He took it. The rest was 10 years. Tell me in the comments, was 10 years worth the price?